Welcome to Backbone Unlimited. My name is Matt Hartsky. In this episode, we're going to break down one of the most misunderstood forces in elk hunting, morning thermals. Now, you might think that you understand morning thermals. I have had gentlemen contact me and tell me that I was completely wrong about thermals, what they do in the morning, because they've never heard a single authority figure on an elk hunting show talk about morning thermals the way that I do. They told me that morning thermals are always rising. And the problem here comes down to what we're talking about in terms of morning, right? Morning is not an arbitrary time, right? We need to very specifically talk about thermals in a way where it's temperature related, and that temperature changes based on what the sun is doing. So are we talking about 6 a.m., 8 a.m., 10 a.m.? All of those are morning, right? But the way that the thermals are acting are completely different at those times. At 6 a.m., the sun isn't up yet, or it's just starting to crest in most Western places during elk hunting season. And so that means that those cooling thermals from overnight were falling, right? As the sun finally heats the slope, sometime probably, between 7 and 8 a.m., the sunny spots are going to start to have rising thermals if it's warm enough to warm that slope up. And then by mid morning, most of the slope is going to be moving upward unless it's in a shaded pocket. And so morning thermals do not necessarily dictate whether the thermals are going uphill or downhill. It's all temperature related. And if you've been hunting elk for any amount of time, you've probably had this happen. You locate elk, you plan the approach perfectly, you slip into position thinking the wind is right, and then suddenly the elk explode out of the timber like they knew you were there the whole time. Most hunters blame a swirling wind or bad luck when that happens, but in a lot of cases, the real reason is something much more predictable. It's thermals. If you're not familiar with who I am, I've been hunting and guiding Western big game for over 34 years, and I've been a professional strength conditioning and nutrition coach for more than 30 years, and I'm here to help you become a more successful and consistent elk hunter and outdoorsman. Now, morning thermals control how scent moves through the mountains during the most important hours of elk hunting. And if you don't understand how they work and how we can break down the morning, you can unknowingly send your scent straight into elk before you ever see them. Today, we're going to break down what morning thermals actually are and how they move through mountain terrain, how elk use them for security, and how you can position yourself so they work for you instead of against you. If there's one factor that consistently determines whether an elk encounter turns into a close opportunity or a blown setup, it's scent. Elk trust their nose more than anything else in the mountains. Their eyesight is decent and their hearing is sharp, but their sense of smell is the real defense system that has kept them alive through predators, hunters, and pressure for generations. And that's why thermals matter so much. Thermals control how scent moves through mountain terrain. They're the invisible conveyor belt that carries human odor through basins, across ridges, and down into timber where elk live and travel. If your scent reaches an elk before you see it, the encounter is almost always over before it begins. A lot of elk hunters think of wind as something random that changes direction through the day. But in mountainous country, air movement is often very predictable because temperature differences between slopes and valleys create consistent airflow patterns. During the early morning hours, especially, thermals often dominate the direction scent travels. Understanding how those thermals behave is one of the biggest differences between hunters who consistently get close to elk and hunters who keep getting winded before the opportunity ever develops. To understand how thermals affect elk hunting, you first need to understand what thermals actually are at their core. I touched on it a little bit earlier, but thermals are simply air movements created by temperature differences in the landscape. They're not random, right? Cold air is heavier and denser than warm air. Because of that, cold air naturally sinks. Warm air is lighter and expands as it heats up, which causes it to rise. In mountain terrain, that consistent cycle of cooling and warming air creates predictable airflow patterns that move through the landscape every single day. During the night, the ground cools rapidly after the sun goes down. As the air near the ground cools, it becomes denser and begins to sink downhill, and that cooler air slowly drains into valleys, creek bottoms, and low basins throughout the night. That creates what many hunters refer to as falling thermals. Now, once the sun rises, the process begins to reverse. Sunlight warms the ground, especially on exposed slopes. And as the ground heats up, the air near the surface begins to warm as well. And that warmer air becomes lighter and starts to rise uphill, creating rising thermals. It's not just a random thing that happens because it's morning, right? It's based on temperature. And that daily cycle of sinking air at night and rising air during the day is one of the most consistent forces shaping how scent moves through elk country. Long before the sun rises over the mountains, the thermal pattern for the morning is already being established. Throughout the night, the ground steadily loses heat after the sun disappears. As the terrain cools, the air closest to the ground cools with it, and that cooler air becomes heavier and denser, and gravity slowly pulls it downhill. That process creates a steady flow of sinking air that drains off of ridges, slides down slopes, and funnels into lower elevations. Over the course of the night, that falling air begins to fill the landscape much like water running downhill. Cold air collects in creek bottoms, valleys, and basin floors, creating what a lot of hunters describe as a pool of cold air at the bottom of the mountain. Every ridge, draw, and drainage acts like a small channel directing that air downward. By the time morning arrives, the entire mountain system is often moving air downhill. For elk hunters, that matters because your scent follows that same path. Before the sun rises, before the sun begins warming the slopes, human scent tends to drift downhill through timber pockets, across benches, into lower terrain where elk often travel or feed. Understanding this overnight setup helps explain why many morning approaches fail before hunters ever realize what happened, because they're approaching from above, right? And those thermals are coming down. Hey, if you hunt public land elk and you're tired of grinding through random seasons, I built the elk hunting series of ebooks for you. Most hunters don't struggle because they lack effort. They struggle because they lack a system. And that's exactly why I built the elk hunting ebook series as a complete progressive framework for Western elk hunters who are done guessing and ready to hunt with intention. Volume 1 is going to be Foundations and Reality. I reset your mindset and expose the assumptions that quietly wreck seasons. In Volume 2, Finding Elk and Understanding Pressure, you'll learn how elk actually move under pressure so you can anticipate instead of react. In Volume 3, Terrain, Wind, and Position, I break down how to use landscape and thermals to consistently create opportunities. In Volume 4, Calling, Silence, and Pressure, sound becomes a decision tool, not an impulse. In Volume 5, Bow Hunting Execution, we're talking about close range strategy so you can finish your encounters. And in Volume 6, Late Season and Post Rut, we're talking about how elk shift after the rut and how to adapt when others quit. This is a system built for consistency. This isn't theory, it's a structured system to help you find elk, read country, and make confident decisions every season. Buy each volume individually or bundle them all to save 50% off at backboneunlimited.com. Now, after sunrise, the mountain slowly begins to change. As the sun climbs above the horizon, its first rays start warming exposed slopes and open ground. The ground absorbs that sunlight and begins heating the air closest to the surface. As the air warms, it expands and becomes lighter than the cooler air around it. And when that happens, the air begins to rise uphill. This is the start of the thermal shift that happens every morning in mountain country, right? But this transition is rarely instant. For a period of time after sunrise, the air in many areas is still draining downhill while the first rising thermals begin developing on sun-exposed slopes. During this window, different pieces of terrain can behave very differently depending on sunlight, shade, vegetation, and elevation. South-facing slopes that receive direct sunlight might start pulling air uphill earlier. Meanwhile, shaded timber, north slopes, and deep drainages can continue holding falling air longer into the morning. That gradual transition period is when a lot lot of elk hunters get into trouble. If you assume thermals have already switched when they haven't, or if you ignore areas where cold air is still draining downhill, your scent can move in unexpected directions and alert elk before you ever realize they're there. I've told some folks this story before, but last year, I kind of thought my morning hunt was over. It was like the fourth day of season. I wasn't getting much talking. I was still hunting a lot of transition zones. And I came down into kind of the last finger that I had before I had a couple mile hike through some open country back to the truck. And I ran into some rubs and some pee maybe from like the day before and fresher poop. And I sat down on a stump nearby and I noticed that, the elk had kind of been digging around in this area, noticed a couple more rubs. And, it was 10 o'clock in the morning. And I was in this, I mean, skinny, tiny little, just a little depression with some trees on it. And it was shaded right there. Sunlight all around on the slopes around me. And I sat down there and was just kind of fiddling around, could kind of turn my brain off of actual elk hunting, and I was just kind of enjoying it and enjoying seeing the elk, had torn up the area. And for some reason I decided to cow call just a little bit. And I'm thinking, thermals are rising around me, didn't pay attention to it, didn't double check the wind, let out a couple of soft cow calls, put it away, was looking on X on my phone. I saw movement out of the corner of my eye and I saw a couple bulls about to enter the little finger that I was in. And no sooner did I see them and they hit that finger at about 40 yards and they hit my scent blowing downhill at 10 a.m. And that was the end of that, right? I hadn't paid attention that because I was in that shaded little finger right there, there were still some downhill thermals going in the direction that they were going to come from. So I blew that. And so it can happen at any point during the day. Thermals could still be going downhill in the shade, right? So you've got to pay attention to those shifts as you're working across the mountain. And those elk were probably already bedded. And elk don't choose bedding areas randomly, right? Mature elk especially tend to bed in locations where the terrain and air movement work together to warn them of danger before it ever gets close. Thermals play a major role in that security system. During the morning hours, elk often move from feeding areas toward bedding cover as daylight increases. When they choose a place to bed, they frequently position themselves where falling thermals carry scent downhill from above them. This allows them to detect anything approaching from higher elevations long before it becomes visible. At the same time, elk often keep their eyes pointed downhill or across open terrain, and that combination, watching downhill while scent drifts from above, creates a powerful defense setup. They can visually monitor the terrain below them while relying on their nose to detect danger approaching from above or behind. Benches, upper thirds of slopes, and thick timber pockets frequently provide that type of security. Those locations allow elk to sit and cover while the morning thermals bring scent down the mountain toward them. For elk hunters, this is why blindly hiking downhill towards bedding area can be so risky. Before the sun has warmed the terrain, without realizing it, your scent might still be drifting down into elk long before you ever reach those areas. One of the biggest mistakes elk hunters make with thermals is simply moving downhill too early in the morning without understanding how that airflow is behaving. When you hike straight down the mountain toward likely bedding areas before thermals begin rising, your scent is usually drifting downhill ahead of you, and that scent can quietly spill through benches, timber pockets, and travel corridors where elk are already moving or bedding. A lot of hunters never realize they've already alerted elk long before they got close enough to see or hear them. Another common mistake is moving too late after sunrise. Once the sun begins warming slopes and thermals start rising, scent begins traveling uphill instead. If a hunter waits too long to move, their scent might start drifting into bedding areas, above them as the thermal patterns have reversed. Hunters also tend to ignore microterrain airflow. Small terrain features like draws, finger ridges, benches, and timber pockets can all redirect air in subtle ways. Even when the general thermal pattern is predictable, those small terrain features can cause scent to drift sideways or pool in certain areas, or if it's shaded, still go down, like the example I gave you. Understanding those details helps prevent the most common problem elk hunters face: getting winded before the encounter ever begins. When I'm hunting elk on public land, my entire morning approach is built around how thermals are moving through the terrain. unless I make a mistake. I'm constantly thinking about where my scent is traveling before I ever take a step towards elk. In the early morning, while thermals are still falling, I'm really careful about hiking straight downhill into areas where elk are likely bedded. If my scent is draining downhill, I assume anything below me is going to smell me long before I see it. So, because of that, I often prefer to approach from the side of the mountain or even from below. Side hilling allows me to stay level with the terrain while keeping a better understanding of where my scent is drifting. I can watch how air is moving across slopes and adjust before committing to a final approach. Timing is also crucial here. I pay close attention to when the sun begins warming those slopes and when thermals begin transitioning. If I believe thermals are about to reverse, I either move quickly to position myself above the elk or I slow down and I wait until the air stabilizes. Morning thermals are predictable if you respect and understand them. When you plan your movement around them instead of fighting them, you can dramatically increase your chances of getting close to elk without being detected. Morning thermals are one of the most consistent and predictable forces shaping how elk move and how elk detect danger in the mountains. There's no reason for you to fail here because of the morning thermal misunderstanding. Every day, the same cycle repeats itself. Cool air sinks through the landscape during the night and early morning, then gradually reverses as the sun warms the slopes and air begins rising uphill. Elk have lived in that system their entire lives, and they use it to their advantage. They position themselves where thermals help protect them, allow their noses to monitor terrain they can't see. For hunters, the lesson is simple but powerful. If you ignore thermals, your scent is often going to reach elk before you ever have a chance to see them. But when you learn to understand how air moves through mountain terrain, you can begin positioning yourself in ways that keep your scent away from elk instead of announcing your presence. Understanding thermals doesn't guarantee success, obviously, but it removes one of the biggest mistakes a lot of newer elk hunters make. Now, if you want to go deeper into elk movement, pressure patterns, terrain positioning, and structured decision making, that's exactly why I built the elk hunting series of ebooks. It's a progressive system designed to help you understand how elk actually use country and how to position yourself accordingly. I've got a link to those ebooks in the description. And if you want hands-on application and real-time breakdowns, we've built an in-person Elk Camp 2026 that is built around this same philosophy: structure, preparation, and execution in real terrain. 90% of Elk Camp is going to be hands-on scenarios. You can check out Elk Camp at backboneunlimited.com. And if you want ongoing access to the Team Backbone community, classroom, my full digital vault of elk resources, private discussions, and direct communication with me for planning, you can join Team Backbone at backboneunlimited.com underneath our membership tab. Everything we talk about here is connected. Preparation is not a single video, it's a system. Thanks for being here. I appreciate all of you. Until next time, train harder, hunt smarter, and never settle.